I just want to thank everyone for joining us for our final night of our three-part virtual discussion series on race and racism, brought to you by Wood Library in collaboration with Project R.E.A.L of the City of Rochester and in partnership with the City of Canandaigua's Equity and Diversity Task Force. So for our final night, we'll address how race shapes media. Tonight's wonderful panelists include local author Catyra Polland. She is a local author of Professionalism, What's That, Dear August, and Love August. She is also the creator and hostess of Editors Knows Best in International Writing and Editor podcast. Miss Mia Birdsong is a Pathfinder, community activist, community curator, and storyteller. Her book, How We Show Up, Reclaiming Family, Friendship, and Community, published in June of 2020, can also be found at Wood Library. Oh, I'm sorry. Sejal Shah's How We Show Up. No? Oh, you're just showing her book? Thank you. Sejal Shah, author of the debut essay collection, This Is One Way to Dance, and professor at Pacific Lutheran University. And that's her book as well. Thank you. And our final speaker of the night is Miss Jessica Farrell, a predoctoral fellow at Fisher Center for Gender and Justice at Hobart William Smith.
All right.
And our moderator for tonight is Letitia Doucette. She's been here for all three nights, and she has some housekeeping rules for us that you guys can follow along with.
Thanks so much. Welcome to our last night. I'm actually a little bit sad because these have been really awesome and a lot of great discussion has been happening. On behalf of the R.E.A.L initiative from the City of Rochester, I just want to thank you for your attendance. Thank you, Alexis, for your partnership. This has been really amazing and wonderful. And I hope that everyone, just takes this as some sort of springboard in order to do more action and create the change that we wish to see in the world. I do have some ground rules because, as people call me, the boundaries queen. I like that. I wish there was a great tiara for it. So we have our captionist down below, right? So if you can't see it, let us know, and so that I can troubleshoot for you. In the chat down below, I gave you some rules, right? So if you have a question, type question. If you have a comment, type comment. And I usually wait until the end in order to allow all of our speakers to speak, and also to give some of the quiet ones, I know y'all are watching, time to process, and then, put your voices into the chat. So just follow those rules and we'll be all set. And I will be voicing the questions for you. So there's no need to raise like the hand, etc. We will definitely get to your questions and comments, all right? So I'm going to move this right along to our first presenter. Jessica, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Letitia, and thank you, Alexis and the Wood Library, for this really exciting opportunity. I'm going to start my screen share here. All right, so you should have it now. All right, so as was said, my name is Jessica Farrell, and I'm the Predoctoral Fellow for the Fisher Center for the Study of Gender and Justice at Hobart and William Smith this year. In that capacity, I'm currently teaching a class that's called Africa in Crisis, Misrepresentations of Contemporary Africa, which analyzes how African spaces and peoples are represented in the media here in the West, the US, Europe, etc., and how the coverage is predominantly focused on when something happens which can be portrayed as a disaster or a crisis. So the class analyzes how this coverage not only reinforces old stereotypes of Africa and Africans that are rooted in the slave trade, colonization, and the Cold War, but also analyzes how these representations shape our stereotypes of Blackness in general, including our stereotypes of Blackness here in the US. So I thought for today I would frame my talk around what I hope are the take-home lessons for my students from this semester. And so I'm going to give you an abbreviated sense of the analysis that takes us to those arguments and conclusions over the semester. So I hope you're with me. We're going to do a semester in 20 minutes. Just kidding. Okay, so to start the semester, I asked my students to help me generate a list of all of the most prevalent stereotypes of Africa and its peoples so that we can tackle them head on. And the list looked a bit like this when they made it. And it looks like this most semesters when I do this activity. So for ease of analysis, I've lumped the stereotypes together to show how they fall into various categories. For example, the first category here is descriptions that relate to nature and climate and the land itself. So things like wild, tropical, rich in natural resources, simultaneously lush and fertile, but also drought-prone and arid, which is an interesting dichotomy of representations, and so I'll come back to that at the end of the list when I synthesize how these different representations can come together. And then just like one big safari, rural spaces with no cities. Of course, we know African cities exist, but when I ask you to call to mind an image of Africa, I'd be shocked if somebody's first mental image was one of an urban space. So then the second category is descriptions relating to level of civilization, I'm calling it. So things like barbaric and primitive, uncivilized, unmodern, unindustrialized, uneducated, and particularly tribal. While tribal is often used to as a sort of coded word to imply that some of the other words in this category without having to come out and say them. So a person who is tribal could probably be described as primitive or unmodern, but those words seem meaner, whereas in general discourse, tribal is considered acceptable, which I would absolutely push back against, but we see it quite frequently. The third category of words relate to violence, things like savage, war-prone with warlords, pirates on the Horn of Africa, etc. For the next category, I couldn't think of words besides how I was naming the category, but portrayals as corrupt and greedy. Then we have words relating to dirtiness and a lack of cleanliness, so literally dirty, but also plagued by disease and covered in flies. Next, words relating to work ethic, so things like lazy, unambitious, in need of charity. And finally, words relating to starvation, so the idea of hunger and starving African. Okay, so I said I would talk about how all of these ideas come together and reinforce one another. So here goes one example. When we think of Africa, we think of a vast savanna full of wild animals like lions and elephants, and where the people live in villages of huts without modern technology or things like indoor plumbing or Western medicine, where there is lush vegetation, but also Africans are frequently starving, so then they must either be too lazy or incapable of managing their land, or they're plagued by droughts and other natural disasters, which then prevent them from being able to produce enough food to sustain themselves. So as you can see, these narratives are often contradictory, but yet they all manage to still coexist. Now you're probably sitting and thinking to yourself, no, I am much better than this. I would never be so problematic as to assume those things. And you're probably right. If you're coming to an event like this, you probably don't think those things. But also because these are stereotypes, they're taking things to the furthest degree. And yet, as I already started to show with the word tribal, there are ways of describing and depicting Africa and Africans which will not raise any eyebrows and which will seem perfectly politically correct, and yet will absolutely reinforce some of these stereotypes. And if we turn to the news media to see how contemporary Africa is represented, we can absolutely see this at play. So first, I just want to take a second to talk about what gets covered in the media. This is a picture from this afternoon on the New York Times website, showing their most recent stories about the African continent. And what we see as we are moving down the list, well, what do we see? We see refugees, counterterrorism, mining, and specifically ecological disaster resulting in infrastructural collapse and death, and tensions around an election that imply corruption. Now, I can give the Times an out by saying that the news is not intended to cover the mundane and the everyday, and they're intended to cover the big events. And often that this means a preponderance of negative things in all contexts, and particularly these days. But I will also say that this contributes to what Chimamanda Adichie calls the danger of the single story, which is the idea that we see so many different stories of American life, and particularly white American life, in the news, in the movies, etc. And so when we hear something negative, we're able to compartmentalize that as one negative thing in a larger positive context. But when it comes to Africa, we only really hear one big negative story. And so we start to assume that that is all there is. We can see that at play here in the US when someone is white and they do something wrong. We're still able to characterize them as though they're through the good things in their life, whereas Black individuals are too often defined by their worst, even in the context when they are the victim or have done something good. But that's because we are more likely to only see the negative. And I'll just quickly, for the sake of argument, throw up rapist Brock Turner being described as an ex-Stanford swimmer to hit that point home. But if we return to the question of the New York Times lineup of stories on Africa today, we see a single story that's at play in a much larger context. All right, so now that I've tried to excuse their coverage, I'm really going to double down on criticizing it. So this is a job posting from the New York Times when they were looking for a new bureau chief in Nairobi in July of last year. And it starts, quote, "Our Nairobi bureau chief has a tremendous opportunity to dive into news and enterprise across a wide range of countries, from the deserts of Sudan and the pirate seas of the Horn of Africa, down through the forests of Congo and the shores of Tanzania. As you can see, like I suggested earlier, no cities are here in Africa. Barely any people, unless they're pirates." All right, let's keep going. Maybe it'll get better. Spoiler alert, it does not. It is an enormous patch of vibrant, intense, and strategically important territory with many vital storylines, including terrorism, scramble for resources, the global contest with China, and the constant push and pull of democracy versus authoritarianism. Yikes. So the vital storylines are all negative. They're all focusing on violence and corruption and the extraction of natural resources. And then to finish it off, the job posting says, quote, "The ideal candidate should enjoy jumping on news, be willing to cover conflict, and also be drawn to investigative stories. There is also the chance to delight our readers with unexpected stories of hope and the changing rhythms of life in a rapidly evolving region." Well, here we're back to conflict again. And then we characterize anything hopeful about the continent as, quote, "unexpected." And we top it all off by speaking about the rhythms, definitely a gesture toward a stereotypical categorization of Black culture there, in a rapidly evolving region, using the language of evolution, which subtly connects back to colonial ideas about evolution from barbarism to civilization. So given that this is their call for a bureau chief, we can see how the New York Times, which is my favorite paper, by the way, so I'm not going to be pointing to you to some better coverage at the end of this talk that's going to solve all these problems. But anyway, we can see how the New York Times, as an institution, is primed to perpetuate these kinds of stereotypes of Africa and Africans, that these assumptions are built right into the structure of their own newsroom, since this is what they're anticipating covering and how they're hiring their staff to work and what they want them to do. All right, so now I want to turn to some actual news stories to look at how the particular language and phrasings being used continue to subtly convey these stereotypes. Now, I've intentionally chosen a news story about a positive event because obviously if I choose a story about something negative, it's going to have negative language. But although that is still worth unpacking how those stories are told too. But for now, we're going to stay positive and we're going to look at the Liberian presidential election in 2017, because my actual research is on Liberia in the 19th century. So it's a context that I'm interested in. So here's the start of a news story from the New York Times as the election was in progress. So the final runoff election was on December 26th, and this was the story the next day on December 27th. Now, I'm showing two headlines here because the New York Times actually has a tendency to use two different headlines, one online and one in print, which is the case here. So the first headline is, "After Liberian Runoff, Hopes for a Peaceful Transition," as the print title. Now, I want to stop here and talk about the use of the word hopes. This just jumps right over the fact that the process has been peaceful so far. And this is almost the end of the process. The first round of elections is done. The second round is almost completed. But more than that, it implies that there is a reason to believe that this peace might not continue. This makes me ask what evidence there is that peace is at risk. Is it just based on history? The fact that the civil war in Liberia ended 14 years before this article? Or perhaps something in the present? And furthermore, that we must hope for this peace suggests that there is perhaps a 50-50 likelihood of violence. It doesn't even suggest that it is more likely than not to be peaceful. All right, well, maybe the online title is better, so let's check that one. Well, it reads, Liberia election could mark first peaceful transfer of power since 1944. I'm going to leave the could alone because I've already been harping on hope. But here I want to know what counts as a peaceful transfer of power. When power transitioned from the transitional government to the democratically elected government of President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in 2005, so from the government immediately after the Civil War and to the democratically elected government, the International Republican Institute declared, quote, their delegations witnessed a generally orderly, calm, and violence-free process. So who decides that that transition doesn't count in order for Liberia to be presented here as having been not peaceful for longer? So if we look down to the start of the article just captured there at the bottom, we see this notion reinforced immediately. Even though this article is nominally about the 2017 election, which has been peaceful, the very first sentence returns to this trope of violence, saying, quote, Liberia has not witnessed a peaceful transition of power since 1944, and the fate of past presidents since 1971, 4 of them have either died in office or been sent into exile, is so grim that many Liberians consider the presidential palace to be haunted. Now, we not only have violence, but we have the supernatural. African spaces are often portrayed as mysterious, and African people are often portrayed as believing in ghosts and the like, which is a real simplification of a more complex worldview that recognizes the existence and power of spirits. And we don't have time to delve into African spiritualities, of which there are many, but it is worth mentioning that such different beliefs are not only portrayed as heathen, but belittled as being absurd far too often. I could go on with this article. I could tell you how every time it mentions a neighborhood in the capital Monrovia, it calls it a slum, or that it characterizes the eventual winner of the election, George Weah, as a soccer legend, which he certainly is. That's certainly true. He is a soccer legend, but it glosses over the fact that his relevant criteria, the relevant credential in the case of an election, is that he's a senator. I could give you these examples and more, but I think you're starting to get the picture. I'm not going to analyze another article, but I'm going to show you a couple from the Liberian Civil War to give a sense of just how, even when describing contexts of violence, and thus when negative language is often unavoidable, the media pushes it in such a way that it reinforces the stereotypes we discussed earlier. Okay, so this is the first example, a piece called Lessons from Africa, War Crimes Without End from 2003. Now, why do I say this is problematic? Well, first, the very generic use of Africa, and then connecting it to war crimes. This is a particular conflict. By the time the article was written, the war involved 2 small West African countries, and it was completely different, separate theaters of the war. There were interconnections, but they were separate. And yet, and the article here is focusing on Charles Taylor, who was the president of Liberia. And yet the headline functions to connect all of Africa to war, and particularly to the extra heinous piece of war crimes, the worst of the worst. So furthermore, this says that war crimes are without end, even though in the first sentence of the article, it admits that the war is over and that the war criminal is in custody. Now, of course, there can be continued repercussions of his crimes, and there's re-traumatization during the trial, but this headline subtly folds into a narrative of Africa as a space of perpetual violence. Okay, so a quick second example. It's another piece from 2003, but this one reproduces an image from 23 years earlier, and yet the text starts to read, a few nights ago. Now, okay, the title of the article says that it's going to address the roots of Liberia's many sorrows. But to reproduce this image and then to have the text start with the present day seems suspicious, as though the context of the photo is almost irrelevant. And particularly since Africa is frequently portrayed as a backward space that lives in the past and is unmodern, it is particularly noteworthy to dredge up an image from more than 2 decades before and present it here largely without comment. The circumstances of the photo are finally mentioned 2/3 of the way through the article, at which point it just describes the situation and doesn't even state the connection to the photograph. Okay, so some concluding remarks. The African continent is often portrayed in the media and in everyday discourses, and even far too often in academic contexts, as a space of violence, corruption, pestilence, and poverty. Such representations consistently rely on a vocabulary of calamity and disaster, but also of inferiority, in order to reinforce stereotypes of Africa as a space of perpetual and inherent crisis. Stereotypes which build on and repeat colonial and Cold War tropes of Africa as uncivilized and barbaric. I argue that because the media focuses its coverage of Africa almost exclusively on negative circumstances, which can be explained as crises and disasters, and because this coverage lacks nuance and instead encourages the consumer to extrapolate the arguments across time and space, media coverage of African spaces and peoples not only reinforces the homogenization of the continent, the sort of Africa is a country narrative, but it reinforces that this is a homogenized space of perpetual, past and future disaster, of war, famine, corruption, disease, etc. Furthermore, I argue that these negative tropes reinforce and contribute to similar negative tropes around Blackness in general, and particularly here in the United States. So we have narratives such as Black men are violent, reinforced by narratives of all Africans are violent, just to give an easy example. As you've seen from some of the nuanced examples I gave, it could be easy to write some of these off as just exaggerations or imprecise wording. But I argue that it is very precise in the sense that it is reproducing the tropes of the past and perpetuating them into new uses today. Thank you.
Great. That was so awesome. Thank you so much, Jessica. Sorry I was late. I was writing so furiously. It felt like class, but a good class. So thank you so much for your presentation. Next up, we have, I believe our order was Catyra is next.
Hello, everyone. I don't know if you can see my video. My name's Catyra. I will go ahead and get started. So one of the things that I wanted to bring attention to is language, of course. So one of the ways that, African Americans, specifically in the United States, are portrayed is through language. So if you read articles, for example, a lot of the time, if there is someone who's formerly incarcerated, the language will say ex-con instead of formerly incarcerated. And of course, when you hear ex-con, it brings forth a different feeling, different response than formerly incarcerated. So I just want to make sure that everyone's cognizant of that. I'm sure everyone notices that, but that's just one of the more common examples of how African Americans are portrayed with harsher, more negative language in the media, either on the news or newspaper or other ways as well. So that is something that I definitely noticed. I was a part of a local initiative here through Causewave, and they did a study of how race is portrayed in the media. So that's one of the things that they focused on. One of the findings is that the language was very much biased whenever the story did involve a African American person. And then additionally, as Jessica mentioned, there are keywords that are used that are not Black, but when you hear them, most you can kind of figure it out. So like urban, when people use that, that's kind of like a hidden term without saying Black. Also at risk. So paying attention to how often you hear that in a story that features a Black person or Black people versus when you're reading or seeing or hearing stories, that do involve those who are not, African American here in the United States. So that's also something that is important to recognize and take notice of, and realize that there is a history of that. That is not a coincidence, that it is the way that we are portrayed in the United States, and that that's why we have those perceptions, because that's what we're fed, that's what we're taught, that's what we're shown. So it doesn't come as a surprise that so many people do believe in certain stereotypes about specifically Black Americans here in the United States. So again, tying into that as well, another one of the findings from that, from that study was also that there were heavy stereotypes for, African Americans here in the Rochester community specifically. So we were overrepresented in sports stories. So again, how many times do you hear about the star basketball player who's, an African American male versus a young Black male who has just won a writing contest? Again, that plays into stereotypes, much like Jessica already mentioned, that also apply to African Americans here in the United States specifically. So that is another way that the media is biased against African Americans here in our country. So that's another thing that I notice, and I'm sure everybody else notices. So also there was also one of the findings was that these stories are more negative, of course, when they involve African Americans in this headline. So lots of stories with Black people with crimes, homicide, robbery, things like that. Very rarely do you see positive stories, featuring Black people, specifically Black males, but just in general. Most of what is covered, you see a lot of negativity, and again, surrounding crime and things like that. So I think these things are apparent, but because we're so used to it, we overlook it. We're kind of numb to it. So just take some time and, sit down and really take a look, maybe do a count. Like that was part of the, one of the studies I did also. We just sat and we watched different stories and we counted how many times we saw a negative story with an African American versus a Caucasian or white person within the span of like 30 minutes or an hour. So maybe if you're just sitting around, you're like, oh, I really do want to see what the perception is, what's being shown to us. How many times do I see this word associated with this group of people? So just for you, and just for your knowledge, and to realize how often it really is and how often it does happen. And then also, along with the negativity and stereotypes, I would also point out even how African Americans are more often to be mocked in the media. So I don't know if you all remember, but there was a cartoon of Serena Williams when she had thrown her racket on the ground. I think it was Australia, if I'm not mistaken. But there was an artist who did a cartoon of her and made her look very savage and animalistic and angry, and mocked her in that way. And then there was actually a tennis player, Caroline Warzik, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, but she had, mocked Serena Williams as well. She had put a pillow in, the front in her chest, and then also, in her, behind herself, basically just mocking the way that Serena Williams' body is built. And that could very much be interpreted as racist. As we all know, Serena Williams looks very different than, the typically white women who play tennis. So again, we often see this type of mockery in media, much more so than any other race here in the United States. And then the final example is also Michelle Obama. I remember seeing, it was a cartoon again of her and Obama, former President Obama, and I think she had an afro, and if I'm not mistaken, they had guns. So again, that militant, angry Black woman narrative that is often portrayed in the media, movies, commercials, music. Sometimes we hear artists who, talk about the type of women that they do not like, and unfortunately, a lot of the times it's Black men saying this about the Black women who look like them. So again, that's media. If you have a famous rapper, a well-known, etc., saying these things, that's a part of the media. That's a part of our narrative, how we're perceived. So again, that's another way that those stereotypes and negativity come through in the media regarding, specifically Blacks and African Americans here in the United States. I do want to follow that up with ways that we can change that, because that's really the most important part. We know we know that this is happening. We've seen it for a very long time. So I think it's safe to say it's not a surprise, but just to give some, I guess, some ways that we can work on that, ways that we can change that. So one of the things I would say is social media is very much driven by the everyday person versus, you know, NBC or CBS or the stations that have people in place who are basically in control of what's going, you know, live, what's going on TV, what's being published, things like that. But social media is really the channel of the average person. So what you can do is use your social media platform to change the narrative. When you see a positive story that involves a Black person or African Americans, Latinos, whatever, you know, underrepresented or misrepresented group here in the United States, you can share that on your wall. You share that, more people see that, and then, you know, it opens up conversation, and that helps to change the narrative and show, hey, yes, there are positive things that we do, but let's focus on that for a change. So you have a lot of power in that. Specifically for my business owners as well. Business owners or community leaders, professionals, if you know that there's something positive happening in the community, again, you can share that. That is like I said, that's a channel where you can make that change versus those corporations where you don't have as much control. And then also, if you are writing a post on your page or you're posting to an organization or business page, be cognizant of the language that you're using. If you're writing a story about a young woman who used to be incarcerated, say formerly incarcerated, don't use ex-con. So you can control that language, you can control that narrative. That's our platform to do that. So those are the recommendations, or some of the recommendations that I have. And then on a more personal level, speaking up in the, you know, places where you work, and if you have a business, making conversation of that. So you know, I do have a full-time job in addition to my editing business, and I spoke up after the George Floyd. There was no conversation about it. Most of the students that we serve resemble George Floyd, not like to a T, but in general, we serve lots of African American males. So I brought it to the attention that there was no discussion about that. And considering the students look like him, the staff don't, I was very disappointed that we didn't address that. Like, we have these, you know, young men here who I'm sure are, you know, this is their first experience with that. And some of them, I'm sure, have experienced it even closer to home. They may have been victims of, you know, police brutality or some type of racism. And, you know, our organization hadn't addressed that. There was no email, there was no follow-up, just saying, oh, we recognize the racial unrest, we recognize that you may have been a victim or that you are traumatized by what is unfolding. So, you know, I mentioned it to management, and then there was, you know, discussion about it. Then there's now a diversity, inclusion, equity committee. So if you see issues in your workplace or with if you own your business, saying something about it, that's how we change it. And if we don't talk about it, then we can't solve it. If we don't acknowledge the problem, we're not going to have a solution. So that's another recommendation I have, so that we can work on not just focusing on the problems, but changing it. We can make it better. We can make it easier. We can make it more fair. We can, you know, practice, you know, being inclusive. So those are the recommendations that I have. And then also asking questions, educating yourself. So if you are not, you know, African American, if you happen to be a white person, listening, and also taking the initiative to learn, but not expecting Blacks to teach you about it. So, you know, books, documentaries, there are many different ways that you can learn about racism, how it impacts people of color, how you can make it better, how it impacts you. what white privilege is, all of those things that you overlooked your whole life or things that you ignored. There are many channels for you to learn that information. And if if you have friends and family or coworkers who are Black or people of color who are facing discrimination and prejudice, I recommend that you listen to them. You don't necessarily have to agree or disagree, but in that space, it's important just for you to have an open mind and be willing to learn. Also be supportive. So that's a recommendation from myself to those individuals who are white, and then recommendations to other Black people or other people of color is to find healthy ways to deal with racial trauma. It's something that happens, what we could say, an hourly basis for Black people in America. That's very painful, very, I would say painful. Can't think of any other words, but very taxing. So if you find yourself exhausted with all that is going on, it's okay for you to step away from that. It's okay for you to take time away. And then the other thing I want to also emphasize is that we all have a different role in, handling and overcoming the racial injustice in the country. So some of us go to protests. I went to one, one that was here recently. Some people have gone to all of the protests. Some people don't go to protests at all. So I think with the climate, there's inclination to judge. Well, you didn't go to any of the protests, so you don't really care, or, things like that. So also don't judge other people for how they're involved. There are people who write letters. There are people who have initiatives, like the freedom riders here. They just launched a chapter where they ride, and they, support and celebrate different Black establishments and Black achievements throughout, the city of Rochester. Like I said, some people write letters. Some people, maybe they have circles in their home where they have different events in their community, or they journal, not just journal, but they journal about it. Some people will be publishing books about it. So find what works for you. We all, like I said, we all have a role. We all have a part to play in it. So decide what works best for you. And just because someone else is doing something different, that doesn't mean that what you're doing isn't important. So don't judge yourself because you're not doing X, Y, and Z, and don't judge other people because they're not doing X, Y, and Z. We need all parts, not just the protests, not just the letters, we need it all. So find out what works best for you, and then continue to, fight the good fight in whatever way, is healthy for you, whatever way is safe for you, whatever way is comfortable for you. Just make sure, you're doing something productive. And again, don't compare what you're doing to other people. We need everybody to join in on that. So those are my final remarks. Again, we know what the problems are. We are all smart enough, productive enough adults, and also children, not just adults, to come up with solutions. So I hope that my recommendations were helpful to everyone. And thank you so much, Wood Library, for allowing me the time to talk. And thank you, everybody, for listening to my input.
Thank you so much. I really love all of your solutions. I feel like there's something for everybody, or do all of them, right? I thought that was just really comprehensive. So thank you so much. And I've been writing notes, so don't worry, all the questions. So thank you so much for your time. Our next presenter is Sejal Shah. I'm gonna spotlight you, Sejal, so that we can see you. There you go.
Here I am.
And so I'm gonna just shut up and give you the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for being here. I thought I would start out with reading from my introduction from This Is One Way to Dance, because it is about race and representation. There was an intermission. It was that long. I saw Gandhi in the movie theater and still remember my indignation that the director chose a white actor to play the most famous Indian. Later, I learned that Ben Kingsley is half Gujarati. His birth name is Krishna. I was 10, growing up outside Rochester, New York, a part of Western New York that's both racially and socioeconomically hyper-segregated. I have always thought about race and representation. I wanted to see something of the life I knew in a book on a screen. I felt that way in the long ago movie theater as a child. I felt that way when I was in my 20s and in graduate school in New England. Sometimes I still feel that way. I began writing to make a point of view, people, and entire cultural references I never saw reflected in what I read or watched. This book is in part about growing up Indian outside of India, in non-Indian places, about the formation of ethnic identity in small cities and towns in the United States, away from urban centers. Kakali Bhattacharya writes, we, South Asian Americans, are sometimes either invisible or hypervisible, co-opted by model minority discourses or caricatured in characters like Apu in The Simpsons. Our invisibility stems from being racialized as non-white and non-Black, so that even in anti-racist discourses, we disappear because we are neither. I wanted to explore the feelings, and that end quote. I wanted to explore the feelings of both invisibility, of not even counting in the racial landscape, and hypervisibility, of always being other, a stranger from somewhere else, the person expected to serve on the Institutional Diversity Committee for Asian Americans in this country. How do you make yourself visible and legible to yourself in a world that often does not see you or only sees race? How do you take up space? These essays meditate on objects in place. How do you move in a body often viewed as other? How do you claim the I, the person dancing, the person leading the dance? These essays wrestle with identity, language, movement, family, place, and race. I am the daughter of Gujarati parents born in India and British East Africa. My life existed both as part of the diasporic culture in which I was raised and where I lived and grew up. And I'll skip around a little bit. I once called this book Things People Say, after my essay, Things People Said, because I found myself so often incredulous and then furious over things people had said to me. It took time to unpack and unwind my visceral responses and what those words communicated to me. I could feel the kick underneath, the teeth, microaggressions. Writing was a way to have my say, to pick up those words like a piece of glass and to turn it over in the sun and consider the sharp edges or blunted corners. Telling the story, rendering a scene, making a list allowed me to puzzle, to make a mosaic of these different parts. I believed there was something to learn and understand in my responses. However, I changed the title after I realized I didn't want to frame my writing only in response to other people's words. Why give them more space? I'll take that space. And wanted to read a little bit more from one of the first essays called Matrimonials that starts out, and it's about my brother's wedding in 1992 in New Jersey. That June day in 1992 was one of the happiest in my life, Technicolor nearly. It was the first wedding for both families. My brother is the eldest grandchild on both sides. My sister-in-law is the eldest on one. The occasion felt momentous, had weight. It was the first time these separate cultures, Indian and American, and for me, distinct selves, coexisted, even merged. In one semi-public place, hundreds of people dancing. The experiences of Indian Americans at this wedding, from the sheer number of people, the food, the music played, rendered our experiences, in Audrey and Rich's words, quote, real and normative, unquote. The culture foregrounded was our own. This was the first time I caught a glimpse of our faces in a larger cultural space. We were beautiful, multiple, mirrored, carnivalesque. We filled the room. It was the first time in my life, outside of 4 incongruous weeks spent at Hindu Heritage Summer Camp in the Poconos, I didn't feel foreign or an outsider in the country in which I had been born and raised. Nothing that day exoticized or historicized Indian culture. It was not the India of James Bond's Octopussy or Indiana Jones in the Temple of Doom, or Masterpiece Theater's The Jewel in the Crown. It was not the historic biopic Gandhi, released 10 years earlier in 1982. We were right here, right now. The only thing that seemed over the top was a sleek ice sculpture of a swan. Northern New Jersey took everything to a different level than Western New York, even back then. And I have a footnote, which is a slightly longer quote from Audrey and Rich, from an essay of hers called Invisibility in Academe. And I wanted to read from that as well. When those who have power to name and to socially construct reality choose not to see you or hear you, whether you are dark-skinned, old, disabled, female, or speak with a different accent or dialect than theirs, when someone with the authority of a teacher, say, describes the world and you are not in it, there is a moment of psychic disequilibrium, as if you looked into a mirror and saw nothing. Yet you know you exist and others like you, that this is a game with mirrors. It takes some strength of soul, and not just individual strength, but collective understanding to resist this void, this non-being into which you are thrust, and to stand up, demanding to be seen and heard, and to make yourself visible, to claim that your experience is just as real and normative as any other. So my essays were written between 1999 and 2019, over 20 years. And so this is part of an earlier essay. Also, one other thing. In 1992, week after week, Americans watched Apu on The Simpsons, the Indian Quickie Mart owner voiced in an exaggerated stereotypical accent by Hank Azaria, a white actor. We watched The Simpsons too. If you judged by our representation on television and in books, we had mastered almost nothing in the public sphere. According to newspapers and the network's nightly news, we didn't even exist yet. But we did. I did. Still, when I heard the reporters on NPR, Lakshmi Singh, Chitra Raghavan, every time I heard their voices and their names, I always stopped and looked up. I heard their voices and the nerves in the back of my neck constricted, attentive to the sound. I took notice every time. And I'll stop there. No, actually, I'm going to read one more paragraph. This is about watching Mississippi Masala in 1992. So that's 10 years also after seeing Gandhi. Before this, I had never seen any representation of my family history, Indians in East Africa, on a large screen, or any screen, nor a South Asian American protagonist. The film follows the romance between Mira, Sarita Chowdhury, and Demetrius, Denzel Washington's character, in Mississippi, where Mira's family eventually relocated after being forced to flee Uganda. Though I had my critiques of both the storyline and the stereotypes of Indian immigrant and Black cultures, I also remember how liberating and extraordinary it felt to watch South Asian American and African American leads, their families, and stories centered in a mainstream film. The desire to see oneself and community reflected runs deep. So I was thinking about what's most racist in some ways for me is invisible, the assumption of who is centered, and thinking about this in terms of style manuals, AP style, who is American, when my book was written about, or it was, you know, an Indian American girlhood, not an American girlhood, or not, you know, or an American childhood, is Black capitalized. I think it is now. And then I took this from Twitter from local writer and activist Ravi Mangla. And I think this connects to what both Jess and Catyra were talking about. This, here's a tweet from him. Reporters have to stop using police-involved shooting, which is pure PR jargon. Police shot and killed a guy, active and passive voice, right? What is actually happening? Who is doing it? Diversity work as diversion and labor. Who is it for? Who does it? Does it change institutions? Thinking of Sarah Ahmed's work on being included, racism and diversity in institutional life. I made up a reading list for Electric Literature. It was Women of Color Tell Their Stories of Mental Health and Community. And in social media, it was tweeted as books about mental illness. And I said, no, it's not mental illness, actually, it's about health, it's about mental health. And so, again, pushing back on how are we describing a book, how are we describing health or illness? And I finally was just thinking about that amazing interview with Toni Morrison. It's with some British interviewer asking her if she's ever going to write for more than a Black audience, I think it is. And she says, you know, you can't understand how powerfully racist that is. And just quoting from that, I stood at the border, I stood at the edge and claimed it as central and let the rest of the world move over to where I was. That she wanted to center Black readership and wanted to feel free to not have the white gaze there, and how powerful she has been as a role model. Claudia Rankin with Citizen, which has that picture of that tennis player that I think Catyra was referring to. And I'm just thrilled that Mia Birdsong, who's also originally from Rochester, is here with us, and I'm happy to cede my time over and get to be in conversation with her. Thank you.
Thank you, Sejal. I'm coughing a bunch all of a sudden, so I'm going to apologize for that right now. Excuse me. And Sejal, thank you for like so many good book references and quotes. So fantastic. So I'm gonna just say a couple things that have come to mind for me during this conversation, and then I'm gonna read a teeny bit from my book. Sejal, thank you for that idea just now. So when I think about how we understand race in America, there's this way in which the contrast between Black people specifically, but people of color in general, and white people exist. So Black people and people of color are essentialized. People will talk about Black culture as if it is one thing. They'll say the Black experience or the Indian experience as if it is one thing. Whereas whiteness is presented as a baseline and as a normative standard that's almost invisible. Like, we know it's there, but it's so accepted as diverse, and that, you know, white people, white people often think of like, not that they don't have culture, right? When we use the word ethnic, we are never talking about white people, even though white people absolutely have culture and have ethnicity, even like beyond people's specific kind of European heritage. White America has an ethnicity and has culture. But whiteness is seen as this normative baseline, this normative standard against which everything else is judged, and is like a standard we're meant to meet, but is also like the place to move from. So when we say things like we need to, you know, accept difference. what we're the kind of coded language in there is that we're accepting something that's different from whiteness. So whiteness is always centered. So I just want to say that about like how we talk about race in America. And then I want to talk about how we talk about racism. So racism is both understood as an extreme, right? So it is, we will acknowledge that something is racist if it, involves, the Klan or cross burning or like explicitly racist language. And things that are racist but not extreme, we kind of talk about with these euphemisms. We say racial problems, or that something is racially charged, as opposed to just saying it's racist. And recognizing that racism can exist on a spectrum and that we can have extremes, right? Like where we're talking about, white violence and like police, white police murdering Black people. And then there can be things that are at the other end that are still racist, but are more like, microaggressions. So one of the things we really need to do is actually articulate racism as racism, and not just think of it as this extreme thing that happens, but recognize that there's a pretty broad spectrum. The other thing is that it is often, when we talk about racism, it's often framed as an issue that people of color have to deal with, when in fact, it is an issue that white people need to deal with. So people of color, Black people, again, more specifically, are kind of charged with being the people who are going to address racism, in workplaces. It is, people of color doing extra labor around diversity, equity, and inclusion, as opposed to white people understanding that racism is actually an issue that they need to address. And that for the past 400 years, what we've been trying to do is get white people to understand that it's something that they need to fix, and take up, that it's not an issue. Like being Black is not the issue. It is white racism that's the issue. But we frame it as a thing that is like a Black issue or people of color issue. The other thing that happens in the media is the qualification of Black worthiness. So, we will talk about, if a Black person is murdered, for example, there is this effort that's meant to try to get people to understand that the value of the life that was taken. But there is all this qualification about the person being, they were hardworking, or they were a parent, or they were a college graduate, or they were, they volunteered a lot. There's all these things that the media will do to try to make somebody respectable. And what that does is it says that certain kinds of Black life are valuable, right? Certain kinds of Black life matter. People who, again, meet this normative white standard are the Black people we should care about. But the other Black people, deserve to be murdered. So there's a way in which the kind of insidiousness of white normativity and respectability gets co-opted in these efforts that we have to try to get, sorry, my son is FaceTiming me right now. This is what happens when you do these things at home. To try to get people to care about Black lives and to recognize that Black lives matter. But if we're saying that Black lives matter, it really is that all of Black lives matter, and that Black people do not have to demonstrate worthiness or value in order to be considered human. And then the other thing I want to talk about is how we change narrative. So a lot of the work that I do is around changing narrative. And the kind of traditional approach to changing narrative is that we have, there's an existing narrative that we don't like and that we find problematic, and we spend a lot of energy debunking that narrative. So we will talk about what that narrative says, and we'll talk about why it's wrong. All of the research on how narrative change works and how people's minds work. In addition to, I think, kind of fundamental reframing of like how we build worlds that we want to live in, says that if we focus on the narratives that we're trying to change, and we repeat them and then say why they're wrong, we're actually reinforcing them. So if you spend your time arguing with, I don't know, your uncle about why something is racist, and you talk about all of the things that whatever that, you know, let's say it's a stereotype about Black people, right? You talk about the stereotype and you name it, and then you talk about why it's wrong. What you're doing is reinforcing your uncle's belief in that stereotype. What works is creating new frames and then populating those frames with different stories. So one of the things that Catyra mentioned was using social media to promote stories that are about Black people that like defy stereotypes, that I wouldn't even necessarily say that are like positive, but stories that frame Black people differently from the stereotypes that exist about Black people. When you do that, when you share those stories, what you're doing is you're populating a new narrative about who Black people are. You don't have to say, look, this Black person is a scientist, not a basketball player. All you're doing is being like, look, here's a story about a Black person who's a scientist. You don't have to say anything about the fact that Black people aren't basketball players. So as we're thinking about, you know, media, how we want to shift narratives about race and racism, I just want to really emphasize that we should not be spending time debunking the things that are wrong. We really should be thinking about, well, what's the story that we need to be telling? What's the counter story? What is the more truthful story? What is the richer, more human story? And then we should be populating that frame with those stories. I was going to say something else. Oh, the other thing is that part of how we have more access to these stories is that we listen to, watch, and read stories that are created by the people who are being told about, right? So if you want to read stories about Black people, like find Black writers, Black creators who are creating those stories. If you want to read stories about Indian people or trans people or disabled people, you should be you should be consuming stories that are created by the people who the stories are about. And in that way, we're like, you're recognizing that people can tell their own stories, but it also shifts who we're listening to, who we're thinking of as an authority on people's identities. And those stories are going to be, excuse me, those stories are going to be richer. Those stories are going to be more complex. Those stories are going to be more human. I only have a couple minutes. I'm just going to read this piece from my book, How We Show Up. What we long for. All of us have ancestral memory of what it's like to live connected, interdependent lives. We may be cut off or too far away from those traditions to claim them, but we can listen to our needs, our longings, and through rite, ritual, and practice, build a way of being in the world that honors and makes tangible our connections to one another, to nature, and to spirit. This is a process of decolonization. Whether you are descendants of colonizers or the colonized, or like me, both, all of our peoples have experienced the loss of something essential to our liberated well-being. Whether that was taken from you or given away in the bargain to win power, it is a loss. Even if you're a more recent immigrant to America, you likely have your own colonization story. And navigating the American landscape means swimming in its slick of genocide, slavery, destruction, and extraction. All of us have something to shed, something to purge, so we can make room for the reclamation and reinvention of community and family. Creating relationships and connection outside the arrangements that our current culture presents to us can be exciting and liberating. We get to be creative, coming up with new ways to understand our connections to others and new ways of connecting. We get to throw out what we've learned to want and discover what we actually want and need. We get to uncover ways of belonging and loving that we didn't see before. But it can also be painful for a whole host of obvious and not so obvious reasons. We may encounter internal and external barriers. And if you're like me, it's easy to question everything to a disorienting degree that pushes you toward an abyss of nothingness. What pulls me back from that edge is understanding not just what expansive connection can look like, but what needs we all want met. We find our way back to ourselves, making more clear what our truth is by listening to the deep longing in our own heart. And I will leave it there.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. And for reading from your book, because I was hoping you would. Mia, Rochester. Okay.
Yes. Can I just say that's the first time I have read out loud from my book, like for an audience. So there you go, hometown.
Oh, thank you so much for honoring us that way. I really, really appreciate that. I know how nerve-wracking it is to like read aloud your own work. So thank you so much for giving us that gift. I have been writing furiously, y'all. And I got lots of questions for you. So I hope you're ready. So if we can all turn on our cameras, that would be great. And I just want to get started because, we've been hitting on some of the same things throughout these past 3 nights, and really thinking about kind of connecting what Dr. Hussein was talking about yesterday, and then what Ricky was talking about the other day, that the body is political. And Dr. Hussein talked about that in the wake of 9/11 and how media was shaping narratives around Muslim individuals. And so I wanted each one of you to kind of really talk about in your own way about how the body is political and how it impacts media. And that media could be, art, right? Music, the news. What's your own take on that? And what are the ways that we can dismantle that idea of the body being political? All right, I will repeat for Mia because she accidentally got kicked off. I know, I asked like a huge question. I told you, I've been taking notes. So I was talking about how over the past few days, we've been talking about how the body is political and how that, shapes narratives around certain individuals within society. And that, yesterday, Dr. Hussein had talked about, Muslim individuals having, this political narrative around them in the wake of 9/11. And I wanted each one of you to kind of touch upon that in the various forms of media, right? We've kind of focused on the news, but thinking about art, music, social media is also good, all its different shapes and forms. So if each one of you wants to kind of touch on that.
Yeah, so I will speak to hair. So that is a huge, component of, I'll speak for not all Black women, but as a Black woman, I can say the experience with hair and how you wear your hair it makes a political statement, especially if your hair is not wavy or straight. If your hair is like an afro, when you wear that style, there are different implications that people have, typically negative, especially against, the mainstream society. So I know we've all seen the stories about, the young man who had to cut his dreads to participate in the wrestling match. I've seen stories about little girls who have had braids cut out of their hair. It's legal to discriminate against people with, I believe it's dreadlocks. There's what's known as the Crown Act that's coming out now, where we're bucking against that, where we are saying that's wrong, that shouldn't be illegal, that we shouldn't be punished for the way that our hair grows from our head. How many women and men, have to think about, how am I going to wear my hair to this interview? And for some groups of people, that's trivial. It's like, my hair is straight. I have straight hair, I have wavy hair, it doesn't matter how I wear my hair. But if you have kinky hair, that's a whole nother, thing that you have to think about. Another thing that people are judging you with. So I definitely see hair as being political. And even now with like anchors who are wearing braids on TV, in their anchor roles as newscasters, things like that, who are, going natural, or wearing their natural hair, not even going, but returning to their natural hair state. So for me, that's a big one that comes to mind when it comes to the body, and what that means politically, or what people perceive politically when it comes to what's on top of your head. So that stands out for me.
I think that, if I heard you correctly, Letitia, part of your question was about like, how do we move away from politicizing our bodies, right? And like all marginalized people, certainly, Black women's bodies have been like the landscape of politics forever. But women's bodies in general, trans people's bodies, and they will be political until we are seen as fully human, and as being able to exercise control over our bodies, and until our bodies are not seen as sources of other people's power. And how we do that, I mean, there's no one answer to that. Like that's the work of like liberation. That's the intersectional work of liberation. And that is generational work. I feel like the only reason that I'm here in front of y'all is because of work that my ancestors did. And the work that I'm doing is not meant to create kind of systemic liberation in my lifetime, but I'm thinking about the generations that are coming after me. So I feel like that's how that works. And I think in the meantime, and Catyra spoke to this as well, those of us whose bodies are political need to do the work of excavating the internalized oppression that we carry around from the politicization of our bodies, right? Whether that is our reproductive rights, or our hair, or our genitals, or our butts, we have to, or skin color, like all those things, we have to make sure that as we're doing this generational work to depoliticize our bodies and to get free, that we are also doing the work of excavating those systems from inside of us.
Thank you so much. Sejal or Jessica, did you want to add your thoughts to that question?
Sure, I can. So I'll speak for a second. When you asked the question, I'm sorry that I'm so in my head about my class today. I'm sure you all are like, we're not actually taking your class. But I was teaching it just before I came here. And what I was teaching today was, we were looking at coverage of the famine in northeastern Ethiopia in 1983 to 1985. And we were talking about the incredibly disturbing news footage that was aired with all, the sea of emaciated bodies, basically. And we were talking about using the theory of Agamben, talking about how people were being reduced to bare life, right? So this idea of being reduced to just the biological necessity of life, and removing a sort of political life, that they were not able to be seen as a full person. And that this was part of the work of humanitarianism, was to reduce the person to this apolitical being, that there was no politics, that it was a site for pity. And I just think talking with my students about how that's incredibly political, and how we construct humanitarianism in this way of morality. It's the role of the West, because of its superior position. You'll see my air quotes going constantly, that we have to take pity on the rest of the world, and this is positioned as an apolitical thing. And anyway, those were some of the places that my head was going when you asked that question. The body is always political, I think, and the ways that we position this to act as though we can step outside it, or that we get to this neutral field that kind of going on what somebody was talking about, the assumption of whiteness as the invisible normative standard, and anyway, thinking also about Western culture as the invisible normative standard, and when we step outside of that. So sorry, that was rambling.
You're fine. Sejal?
Let's see. Well, you have to remind me what the question was again. As I'm listening, I always forget what the question is.
Okay, I'm the same way. So it's talking about how the body is political in the ways that we can dismantle these types of narratives within the media, or maybe not.
Yeah, I was looking at a comment in the chat, right? Can someone comment on the way media and politicians keep gesturing towards making Kamala Harris's Indian identity non-existent and invisible? And I have an epigraph at the beginning of an essay that used to be called "Where Are You From?" and it's called "Who's Indian Now?" And I think it speaks to this. So this is Jasbir Kapoor, who is at Rutgers, I believe. A South Asian friend of mine, born in Guyana, raised in Canada, and living in England, once said to me, "It always comes down to the same one question: where do you come from?" In time, I began to see that it is actually the question, not the answer, which is problematic. Exclusion imposes criteria on its respondent. You must come from somewhere, some one where that is most probably not from here. And I launched into a story about being asked what my nationality was, and I said I'm American. And then the guy says, "But where are you from originally?" And I said, "From upstate New York." Anticipating his next question, I launched into a version of my stock story. My father was born in India. My mother was born in Uganda and grew up in Kenya. We're Indian. I'm Indian. And I wrote the first version of this essay 20 years ago, and I remember thinking, I don't think I would answer that way. Or I remember thinking as a child, when I hadn't been to any of those countries, why would I not be African American if I'm also Indian American, right? If you're American because you are born in the U.S. In terms of Kamala Harris, I think people get to define who they are and how they want to be seen. She said that she identifies as a Black woman. I don't think that that's erasing her Indian heritage necessarily.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, it kind of speaks to, I think, different cultures. My culture, the question is, who are your people? That is what's important, is the lineage, and that means something. Like my last name means something, right? And carries weight with it, and that's how you can understand whose family did what, who you needed to go to for certain things, etc. And also that your family name means something, and that's such a different question than like, where are you from, right? I don't know.
Right, oh, sorry, I was just going to say, I think sometimes, even though I wrote about race and representation, I feel like focusing on where someone's parents are from, is not necessarily what we need to be doing right now. Like, what are her policies on, on various issues? Like, I think that matters more.
Yeah, it does. And I think, it's kind of a non-starter, right? Like, what are you trying to figure out by where are you from, right? That type of question really doesn't lead to what is that person's values, what kind of food do they like, what is their culture, the morals, the practices, right? As we talked about, it's that, the Western being that normalization. And speaking of that, Jessica, I have a question for you. So it's been mentioned Toni Morrison, who is amazing, and how she really kind of lived up to what James Baldwin said of getting the white man off of your shoulder, right? And so for white people, how do they get the white man off their shoulder, decolonize themselves, and what does that process actually look like for white people? We have examples like Toni, for those who are Black, right? But what does that look like from a white person's perspective?
Sure. I mean, I would say it. So I'd like to go to what Mia was talking about, the kind of racist on a spectrum, and I think it's accepting the fact that we have a lot of work to do, and we need to internalize and accept where we're at in order to move from that. So one of the things I work a lot with my students is to think about their internalized bias. And so the most recent example is I took a day to do an exercise recently about the protest up in Rochester. And I showed my students first the news conference given, this was back on the Sunday, just after the Saturday protest where people got trapped in the church with the pepper bullets being shot at the church. So it was the next day when the plan came forward to bring the elders out to use as a buffer. Anyway, I had my students watch the news conference that was given by Mayor Lovely Warren and then Police Chief LaRon Singletary. And then I had them watch the protesters, Free the People Rock, in their press conference. And I asked my students to write up accounts of each. And then we looked at what the biases were. And I asked them, these are two absolutely contradictory accounts of what has been happening. Which one do you trust? Which one are you implicitly going to trust? And ask them to recognize that, especially in white America, we are raised to believe that an authority won't lie. And yet I believe what those protesters are saying. I mean, one, I was there that night, but two, I believe what they were saying. And so if you believe them, then you have to know that the police chief was lying. And so talking to them about these systems of authority and how where we root our ideas of authority and how these are based on racist, gendered, sexist, classist systems where we place this authority and trust. And so asking my students and myself to really interrogate that bias. And there's been a lot of talk tonight about coded language, and that's absolutely something one of my students asked me, you want me to think about individual words? And I said, yes, every single one of them. I want you to think about why you're saying what you're saying and how you're saying it. And Catyra was speaking about that, and I thought very powerfully, we need to be aware of what we're saying. So I think that's one of the things that white Americans need to be ready to do right now, is that introspective, that hard labor of accepting where you are, not lying to yourself and pretending that you're not racist. You are. All of us need to accept that and figure out where we go from there, especially learning. And I thought it was a great point. There are so many resources out there to learn, come to sessions like this, etc. That it's up to us to do the labor. So
hey, Letitia. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
Letitia, I have a little passage in my book about white people and what they need to do. I'm going to read from that, if that's all right with you.
I have your book, so yes, you do.
Okay, good. Thank you. All right. Hopefully my internet will stay together while I do this. I'm going to leave my video off, though, audience, just so you know. Huh? Page 28. Oh, thank you. Page 28. In case I cut out, Sejal will pick it up. Thank you. All right. American capitalism extracts from poor and middle class people and from our planet and builds detachment and greed in the hearts of the wealthy. Patriarchy hurts women and gender nonconforming people, and it also limits men. White supremacy harms people of color, and it also diminishes white people. I'm going to repeat this because I want to be irrefutably clear. The harm experienced by the oppressors is not equivalent to the harm experienced by the oppressed. Capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy are not good for anyone, but the work that needs to be done by those who exert oppression and those who are targets is markedly different. While the corrupting power of capitalism on rich people and the restrictive nature of patriarchy on men is fairly apparent, white supremacy's negative impact on white people is underexplored and warrants some unpacking. Even pointing that out makes me uncomfortable because white people exploring the harm of white supremacy on themselves should not prioritize that work over the work they must do to end the way it harms people of color. But I agree with what Lama Rod Owens calls the trauma of whiteness is not going to be wholly healed without white people recognizing that they have work to do on themselves, and that includes understanding how their own liberation is impeded by white supremacy. When we hear white supremacy, we tend to think of blatant, visible racism like Klansmen, the N-word, or modern-day Nazis. I'm focused more on the mundane and insidious white supremacy that is embedded in American cultures, systems, institutions, the dynamics of relationships, and our own psyches. As Tema Okun points out in her piece, White Supremacy Culture, culture is powerful precisely because it is so present and at the same time so very difficult to name or identify. It's the pervasiveness and sometimes near invisibility of white supremacy that makes it both hard to pull apart and toxic. There are a variety of downsides to white supremacy for white people. There's the proximate harm of having people of color you love, the proximate harm of having people of color you may love be harmed by white supremacy. There are also contributions from people of color we are collectively missing out on because white supremacy creates barriers for people of color's brilliance. There's the soul-deadening impact of having an identity that is predicated on the oppression of other people. My friend Courtney, who's white, told me, I think of it as a festering wound at the center of our lives, this deep knowing that the country and by extension our own lives have been built on the backs of others. The American dream is white supremacy culture bound up with capitalism and patriarchy. In addition to espousing a belief that white people are superior to people of color, white supremacy culture is also a culture of rigidity, efficiency, more is better, ignorance is bliss, scarcity hoarding, binaries, and toxic individualism. My friend Matt, also white, spoke to how it limits his ability to connect with others. White supremacy makes it harder for white people to connect authentically, understand others, and accurately empathize. Since oppression is definitionally a form of dehumanization, since it denies the full subjecthood of those being oppressed, I think there's a deep level in which it limits human connection. It keeps white people from being deeply known to others and themselves. It casts what is human about white people as weakness. And I think part of what is so deeply underexplored when it comes to white people and their own, and this is why it's important to me. So mostly I want white people to stop being racist, right? I want people of color to not have to experience racism anymore. But I think that like the altruism that white people often engage in when it comes to unpacking their own biases and doing things to end racism is limited. And I think that white people need to understand that they are harmed by white supremacy. And I think part of that is that white people need to figure out who they are without white supremacy. And I don't think most white people have engaged in that journey, and we don't have a lot of articulation of it, right? Like we do have this understanding of the ways in which, like, masculine constructs and patriarchy are not good for men, right? It tells men that they're not supposed to cry, they're not supposed to like be fully feeling human beings, and we don't have that same understanding of whiteness for white people. And I feel like that's some of the work that we need to do so that white people have a clearer sense of how white supremacy is harming them.
Thank you for that. We are of like mind in that. I always, in my role in the initiative, the R.E.A.L initiative, thinking about how do you develop white identity outside of white supremacy.
Yes.
And this is also personally important because I'm dating someone who's white. And that is essential because that white ideology can cause harm in an intimate relationship, whether it's intentional or not, right? And so, particularly in interracial relationships, I think that it's so important on like the white person in the relationship, whatever your relationship configuration may be, to really work on getting the white man off of their shoulder, right? Because if you say you love that person and care for that person, what does that look like if you are doing harm in many, many different ways because you have not done the real hard personal work of dismantling, that white man off your shoulder. So, I really encourage everyone to get Mia's book. Sejal, if you don't mind holding it up to the screen for everyone. I think it's, multiple copies, yes. And, also getting Sejal's work, if you don't mind holding yours up as well. Yes, because these are, perspectives, etc. And Catyra, do you have your pieces available to show folks?
I sold out of mine. I'm gonna pull it up on my laptop and do it that way.
Sold out, yes. Congratulations on that.
But you can find them all at what library and check them out?
Great. That is awesome.
Thank you for the plug for the library. Yes.
Yeah, I have them in the library as well.
The libraries are awesome. I feel like they are the unsung heroes sometimes. And, it's a wealth of education and learning, etc., that is available, at no cost to you. Just go and if you don't have a library card, I encourage you to get one and visit your local library. So I think, this is a great way to kind of wrap up the series because thank you, Care Work. Yes, there it is. One of my favorite books. I teach that to my students. Awesome. Thank you so much. Look at all of this. So, thinking about yesterday's discussion in that we had someone who lived through segregation really asking these deep questions that we've touched upon today. How do you begin to get what she called, the sin of racism out of ourselves and our society, right? And how long will it take for folks to actually do something, right? She said she was fixing to leave this earth soon, and she wonders, what more will it take in order to get people to move into action, right? And so you've heard throughout these 3 nights various perspectives, individuals, thoughts, right? From the personal to the classroom, thank you, Jessica, to lived experience across, Muslims, to Indian heritage, to the very various levels of the Black experience. And so I want to thank everyone for your time, your thoughts, right? Putting your heart into all of this, even though, it might have been a little bit unstructured. I think we get to where we need to be. And that's part of my kind of cultural thing. Like, let's break down the structure and get to the humanness of things and create as we move. And that's a different way of being. And I thank you for, taking that journey along with all of us. And so for all of you who are watching this, I really hope that you take something from this. Catyra gave us a laundry list of things that we all can do, right? You have heard from Sejal. She put it in the chat. A laundry list of books that you can read and actions that you can take. And thinking about the words that Mia gave us and Jessica gave us, take a class, but also put it into action, right? Action is the biggest thing that we need right now. And thank you so much, everybody. I hope this has been a great experience. Thank you, Alexis. If you want to give us any closing words, I know I ramble a lot, so it's okay.
You're fine. I just want to thank, all our final panelists for tonight, Jessica, Sejal, Catyra, and Ms. Birdsong for being here, and Letitia for you being here all 3 nights. And for our audience tonight, and for anyone who's tuned in for all 3 nights of this event, and just being open to hear these conversations and to learn about different ways you can learn and grow, and just change your perspective on the way you do things. So thank you guys so much for being here, and I appreciate everyone for tuning in and engaging in these conversations.
And lastly, thank you to our captionist. I forgot to mention you. You've done an exceptional job. Thank you so much for making this accessible to people.
Thank you all. Thanks to my hometown.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you. Thank you, Wood
Bye,
Library.
thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thanks so much.